Hello. Hey, this is John Arnold, J. Arnold and Associates, and I'm here with my longtime colleague, Chris Fine of
Integrative Technologies.
Okay, and we're going to talk about a few things. So this is going to be the first podcast that I'm going to run here on my newsletter. It's going to evolve, but I've been talking about this for a while, and I'm really glad that Chris and I could spend some time. We are here at the MoNage event. It's also the money event too. Well, I'll turn this over to Chris in a second, but we're in Mountain View, California at the Computer History Museum, so a very appropriate spot to be talking about the latest in technology, especially where we're going with AI and how it's impacting both enterprise and financial markets with blockchain. So just giving you a bit of background to where we are right now. It's April 18th. We're going to be ending up the conference shortly today, and we're going to give our impressions in this first podcast I'm running here with my pal Chris. So Chris, let's set the stage a bit. What has Jeff been doing here?
Well, the MoNage conference, John, and we've been here at this series of conferences since the very first one up in Boston. You know, coming out of his years of conferences with the Voice on the Net conference and Jeff's series of Twitter conferences, the 140 Conf, he felt that there were some significant changes in the way people were communicating. So the premise of the whole MoNage series was how do we communicate? And it started out with thinking about just messaging in the workplace and, you know, how we were evolving from phone calls and other email. But now it's really grown to embrace chatbots, AI, and this year more and more blockchain, to the point where the blockchain and crypto thread of all of this, Jeff actually had to spin off into a separate program that ran simultaneously. So it's interesting. It's interesting to see how this has grown.
Yeah, for sure. And for those who don't know, Jeff started in the VoIP space where voice was kind of the driver for innovation and disruption. And he has a habit of getting in and getting out at the right time. And what he ended up doing was moving on from the VoIP space kind of just before it kind of peaked. And now he's moved into the messaging space where he sees the next big wave of disruption. And Chris and I have been doing our bit to help drive that. But this time around, we switched it again. We've been talking about messaging, but this time we talked about now what we call the new voice, which is really AI-driven, focusing on really how voice is shifting from a person-to-person application to one that's person-to-machine. And that kind of puts us right in the middle of what's happening here at the conference. Right, Chris?
Yeah, John, I mean, we heard a phrase used here I thought was pretty interesting called digital employee, where not only is the process becoming digital of work more and more, but you're actually getting employees that are not people starting to appear and interacting with the people. So the communications is becoming people to machine as much as people to people, and that's starting to have a major impact on business.
Yeah, so what would you say, have been kind of the big takeaways so far? Let's just look at the MoNage stuff first, and then maybe talk a bit about the blockchain things.
Well, I think with MoNage, it just continues to be where we hear less and less of what I would have called traditional enterprise communications. It's gone down to a really minimal presence where it's now, messaging is now almost the last generation, right? When you hear about messaging, you hear about really only products like Slack. You don't hear, at least at this conference, as much about some of the more traditional messaging platforms. And more you hear it being voice-powered.
Yeah, and very developer-friendly. This conference is not a marketplace of buyers and sellers so much as it is people who are kind of building this and, creating the new applications of tomorrow, not so much from the household names like the Cisco's and Avayas and Microsofts, but more a lot of startups. We are in Silicon Valley after all, so we're seeing a lot of things here that really don't get to the mainstream for a while, so it's kind of a cool spot to be. And I think it's been interesting that, there's a lot of talk here about security, a lot that's mobile friendly, but interestingly, a lot of people here are from outside of the U.S. This is a real global trend for sure.
Well, we've seen a presence from really most markets in the world, and it's also interesting to see the different forms so many of the companies take. They're very there are some traditional startups, but there are many just bootstrapped without venture capital so much. just on an idea and a platform, a publicly available cloud infrastructure, etc. So the time from inception or idea to demo is just way, way down.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is a cool place to be, to kind of see where tomorrow's applications are coming from. A lot of creative energy. And it's interesting that there are a lot of young developers here, but there are a lot of people who have been in the space a long time too. So this is an interesting time where millennials are certainly playing a role in the innovation, but there's a lot of people who are very experienced, who've been through many of these cycles of moving from hardware to software and now seeing kind of a new way forward for these applications, because it's a very different world. We're way past talking about VoIP and phone systems, that's for sure.
Yeah, John, that's right. I think, a major trend in all of this that I see is just the erosion or elimination of borders. Mm-hmm. So you see more and more of these companies and ideas where they're really not distinguishing too much between B2B, B2C. A person may buy or interact from any perspective or any role that he or she plays. It's not just as an employee, it's not just as an individual. So there's a lot of opportunity, but a lot of challenges for that with security, separation of data, privacy, a ton of stuff.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so let's just wrap up with a few impressions of the blockchain and money side of what Jeff is kind of putting us in the middle of here.
Well, I would say, though I'm fascinated with money and blockchain, I probably saw mostly from trying to help out with the MoNage side of this. I saw more from how blockchain's impacting communications. And I would have to point out just seeing such a wide range of potential applications of the blockchain. And one I would bring to mind that was really interesting was how it could be applied to voting and politics. Yeah,
that was interesting. We've had a few regulatory people speaking here from the legal community, which says that it's getting their attention now. And I also was interested by one of the speakers. It was the high-end phone, and he talked about this making a phone that was kind of built for blockchain use.
That was fascinating.
Yeah, and I think that's a good sign of what's to come, that the endpoints are probably not secure enough for what blockchain is trying to do, but I think that's a sign of where things are going to go in terms of if blockchain is going to become a mass market concept for consumers and ordinary people to use, it's got to really speak to the endpoint. The experience has to be easy to use, obviously, but it's also got to be bulletproof, secure, and it's got to work. Otherwise, those phones could be targets for theft pretty quickly, right, with Bitcoin.
Well, it was interesting that the blockchain phone session was particularly interesting because they're selling them. Mm-hmm. So they developed, this is a very expensive device, and they developed a version of Android that is super secure. And apparently, or at least what the presenter said, is they're pretty popular among celebrities in the years post BlackBerry and after some of the hacks that happened a couple of years ago. So it'll be interesting to see if that succeeds and what the big companies and service providers do.
I think that could be a canary in the coal mine for all of us, because blockchain is such an abstract idea, but when it starts to be applied to tangible things like endpoints, it becomes a lot more real and easier for people to relate to. So I would say watch for that.
Yeah, and there's challenges to overcome, right? So
price?
Well, not only price, but for the blockchain, it's always the latency of it. Mm-hmm. So, for example, on the phone session, he said, well, people don't care 10 to 15 seconds to establish a session. And I'm thinking, John and I work on communications all the time and user preferences, and it's like that is a fairly long time to make a connection.
Too long.
But if we come back and talk to you in a year, I have a feeling it's going to be completely solved.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so let's bring this to a close. So thank you all for listening, and we'll be back to you with another podcast session soon. So stay tuned and keep following both Chris and I. We're writing about this stuff all the time. So we'll be back with another podcast soon. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, John.